So we are so delighted to welcome them and to learn more about how the Vanport Place Marking Project came to be and what it involves. So I will turn it over at this point to Maryhelen.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity. And Don, one of my first notes was we first met, quote unquote, via email. So it's good to see you in person. June 17, 2019. Mark Wubbold from the, I see Mark down there. Hi, Mark. Connected us and has worked with us on this project. He is a senior policy analyst in President Percy's office. So it's taken a village to get here. I first became involved in remembering Vanport through the Vanport Mosaic project, which still continues to collect oral histories about Vanport and memories of the people that were children then, or had relatives or whatever. I and two other people organized the first narrated bus tour of Vanport. Previously, it was a 5-mile walk, and the first festival was 2016, and Amanda Fritz opened that. And one of her directives to me was, Maryhelen, everybody can't walk 5 miles, get a bus. And she walked off. So I thought, I can't argue with Amanda Fritz. So I had connections with the port. They offered their buses. The FAA made a federal agreement with the port to take the buses off property, and the bus tour happened. 240 people went on bus tours that day, and the number one thing that we heard was, I haven't been, or the two number one things, I never knew there was so much here. I didn't know anything about Vanport. And the one that struck me the most was, I haven't been back since I evacuated. And what was here? And I remember that the school was here. Well, there really wasn't a school, it was a recreation center. So a couple of people that organized the bus tour said we should put permanent signs out. The Park Bureau agreed, and this is where we are today. I had hoped that somebody other than me would take this project on, because I thought it was such a great idea, and I still do, so that people can learn about Vanport and what was there and who was there and the history. A lot of people, Vanport was there for 6 years and destroyed by a disastrous flood. There was over 100 years of people, Native American people living on the site. There were a great amount of agricultural opportunities that were wiped out by building dams when the flood happened. And there's a lot of history to be told. And a lot of you may know far more than I've learned in the 4 years that I've been involved. My little anecdotal story was I lived on North Baldwin off of Vancouver when I was a child, and my mom worked as a nurse nights. And there was a gas station called Bozeman's that was run by a man named African-American man named Stan Jordan. My mom got her car serviced there, and he offered to be my daycare provider while she went home and slept. So Stan is who taught me how to add. I didn't ever go to kindergarten because he taught me how to write, how to add numbers. And at the time in the 50s, that was quite unusual for a African-American man to be taking care of a 5 and 6 year old white child. Caused a lot of grief for my parents in the neighborhood. But I learned that color didn't matter, because I benefited greatly from color. So I, working on this project, hope to bring that enlightenment to others. I think now I'm going to turn it over to Tanya and let her do the PowerPoint slide of where the project is. It's been very popular. We've gotten funding. Through Mark and others, we've made connections to create these signs, and a lot of interest. And maybe, just another anecdote, maybe too much attention. So we invite you to share your experiences. Samantha has said that she would record or copy, whatever, the chat session. So if you want more information, want to be in our contact list, put your information in the chat, and we will add you to our list. I don't know, we've launched our new website. We can give you that information. Tanya, I think, has it in her slide presentation.
I put the website in the chat for everyone already.
Okay, good. And so we encourage you to be involved and provide us information or ask questions. And I think that's all we have. I think Don said we have 5 or 10 minutes at the end for questions. So we'll be able to do that. But Tanya's doing this on her lunch hour, and I might steal some of her thunder. But besides being a PhD with historic preservation and a lot of historic research behind her, her favorite job is driving the Zamboni at the Lloyd Center ice rink. So she's now on her lunch hour and not driving her favorite Zamboni. So off to you, Tanya.
I unmuted. Is it working on the screen share?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Seems to.
Are you getting the, let me see, if I put it on presenter view, is that better? Let's see. Okay. So when the ice rink shut down, and I had heard that Maryhelen was working with a friend of mine, Kim Moreland, I thought, oh, I have some time now to help out with this project. And, you know, I reached out to Miss Maryhelen Kincaid, and she was like, we need you for a lot more than what you think. So I got roped in, which is great. So a great use of time when we were shut down. And I saw a couple people in this room. I saw the chair of my dissertation, Carl Abbott. Thank you for coming. And I saw Nancy Chapman, who may not remember me. I had an office when I worked for Dr. Jan Semenza, and I'd see you oftentimes when I was with my young children in the building. So glad that there's familiar faces in the room. So Vanport Places started, as Maryhelen said, she has developed a board, and the real goal and intention is to create public history markers at the site. And when COVID hit, that meant a lot of archives and depositories were suddenly cut off from the project. You know, you want to have usage to create the primary sources that you want for those markers. And I'm probably one of the few people that hoards pictures and has a lot of ephemera collector friends. So I think under the circumstances, I was probably a pretty good pick for a pinch hitter for getting these markers up and fabricated. And I'm not sure how much people know about Vanport, so we definitely are going to cover Vanport as well, so you can understand the significance and the rationale for why we want to create public history at that site. One thing we have to remember is that the land where the public housing project that is going to dominate this conversation existed was originally land of First Peoples, and a lot of research and efforts were acknowledging that. And so this area that was Vanport that we're talking about today from 1942 to 1948 is now known as Delta Park, and it rests on the traditional homeland of indigenous peoples who settled, migrated, hunted, fished, gathered, fought, and traded on the land along the Columbia River for hundreds of years. These ancestors include, but are not limited to, the peoples of the Chinook, Multnomah, Clackamas, Pelican, I'm horrible at pronouncing this, Kalapuya, and Molalla tribes. They made their homes along the Columbia River, which provided plentiful natural resources, and were honored to study the history of old people upon these lands and hope to connect with the descendants who lived on this land. And right now, Maryhelen and I have just submitted a grant with Kristen Miner, who's the Landmarks Commissioner, one of my former students when I taught historic preservation in the Urban Studies Department. Brendan Spencer Hartle has been really pushing us to get involved to work on doing a landmark recognition of the site. And that would include not only Black history, but also history of First Peoples and other groups. So if you've never seen Vanport, it's out by the I-5 and the Columbia River. If you've ever been to Portland International Raceway or the Blue Heron Golf Course, driving out on the I-5, the orangish markers are superimposed on the bluish current background, And where those black markers are, and I'm really glad when I saw that a lot of you were on desktops, because it's really hard when I do Zoom calls with people on cell phones because I have too many graphics. So this is showing there's an interest, although it's not a big mission right now to do an interpretive center and to do these different historic markers at 3 different locations. And we understand a lot of people who come out to the International Raceway and golfing maybe don't know the history. And we're hoping to gather people. If, you know, one person in a group is very excited and wants to stay and watching the raceway and the other person gets bored, I'm hoping that they're going to be able to walk around and learn about history that maybe they didn't know about or weren't expecting to know about. And Maryhelen talked about how for many people who come back to the site, it's very hard for them to find where they grew up, where they lived, because the entire city was eradicated in 1948. So through these efforts, our hope is to actually get place markers down in which will help people find their homes and find places that they remembered as well. So to honor the people who lived through and lived and grew up in this site, as well as to teach the next generations about the existence of what was once the 2nd largest city in Oregon. This is what one of the markers is going to look like, just to give you a sense of scale. This marker is in fabrication currently, so had you had Maryhelen present to you a year ago, we wouldn't have been this far along. So our intent is to have this up fairly soon, and this particular marker is funded primarily through Prosper Portland. And you'll get to see some close-ups of it, but just to give you an idea of what we mean by historic marker. So it's a public history marker. So talking about Vanport and the name of Vanport. So Vanport is a federal defense war housing project, and it was the largest federal housing project ever built in the United States. I did my dissertation work on the 8th largest housing project built in the United States, which meant that at home during COVID, I had a lot of notes on the largest housing projects since they were in the same city. Except, let's be honest, Vanport is in city limits today, but at the time it wasn't. So originally in the architectural drawings, it's called the Denver Avenue Project, and that denotes a geographic proximity to Denver Avenue. Later, it started to be called Kaiserville, which denotes the fact that Henry Kaiser strong-armed and built the city, knowing that he needed housing for his shipyard manufacturing. He did not want huge amounts of turnover. In order to prevent turnover, he needed to have a place for housing for his workers. And it basically gets nicknamed Vanport City, but there's no mayor, there's no city hall, and the landlord ended up being the Housing Authority of Portland. So it was never a chartered city. And we have a picture there of Forest Lake, and they brought in sand and made a recreational area there. And I did not realize that that wasn't the original Forest Lake, that the original Forest Lake, that the Forest family who had a land claim in the same property, that they had filled that in. So there's so many man-made changes to the site. This is another one of the markers, and it's going to be at the theater site. And this is in mock-up still. It hasn't gone into fabrication or gone through any sort of design iteration. So I work on kind of a mock-up. I pass it by as many experts in housing and history. Someone's an expert in women's history. I'm going to share the women's history marker with them. I try to meet with people even during COVID in person and go over the content. And we've had professional editors brought in, because I think anyone who knows me knows that I can't spell my way out of a paper bag. I saw some spelling mistakes on the last slide, so I'm very aware of that. So that's why we have a team of people working on this. And Maryhelen has really made sure that we have a lot of people that way, different lenses, and people from different groups, different ages, different races, all have been able to have input on the content of the markers. Another amazing thing that we've been working with Sarah Architects is to have an augmented reality of the site. So that when people go to the actual historic, these markers, these public history markers, there's going to be a QRC code on each of the markers, and you will be able to go to our website. Once again, I put that website that is live now that I've been working on with an amazing team, mostly from the Columbia Slough Watershed Council. And so this other team of architects from Sarah Architects, they've made it so you can download an app onto your cell phone or an iPad, and you can walk around the site and the buildings will pop up. So this GIS mapping will be there. So if somebody knows where the house is, but the topography of the land has changed so much that you have no ability to discern where the house was, where your unit was at the development, it'll help you find it. And remember, this is I don't think I stated it, but this is over 300 acres of land with housing that housed at its peak 40,000 individuals. So it's very massive, and there is not much left. So here's some views of some of the built construction in it. Like I said, it was the second largest city in quotations because it wasn't really a city, but it was an ethnically diverse city. So during the war years, there was a large population of African Americans, and after World War II ended, the African Americans, because of discrimination in Portland, were left behind, but we also have GIs moving in, students moving in, and I think that's going to be important. We're going to talk about it more because I know I'm speaking to a group from Portland State University, and your foundings of your University of Vanport College were here at this site. So there was furnished housing provided to college students to move in to Vanport after the war, and additionally, large numbers of Japanese who were able to return to the city after their expulsion and inhumane treatment. This was where they were able to restart and return to their city as well. What is left of Vanport that is discernible, and which we're bringing in the archaeology team, I hope, if the grant gets funded, and it would be very much led by a team from PSU, is this foundation that you see on the right. So I have a picture from Norm Goldston's collection on the left. He's one of those private collectors that didn't shut down for COVID. His grandfather had helped build Vanport. He had paycheck stubs from his time of his grandfather's employment, and he has one of the largest ephemera collections in Oregon. It's possibly the 5th largest collection in the state of any photographic collection and ephemera collection. So I was fortunate enough that he was able to share with me a lot of pictures, and I've been talking to a lot of theater experts. So this movie theater held capacity for 750, and you have to think that when you have a city of 40,000 and it's built on a land that had not previously had usage, they had to build not only the housing, they had to build entertainment, schools, grocery stores, everything. So it was built from the ground up in less than a year. Here's an aerial of the city, just to give you an idea of scope, of just how massive this development was. And it would have been daunting to live there because it really was in a bowl. So there was these levees and dams and structures, these man-made earthen. So you would be living in the middle of a bowl. You wouldn't be living up high and getting to look out at a vista of any kind. One of the first markers that I worked on, because I felt comfortable when I was saying, hey, I think I could do this, let me show you what I can come up with, was the women war work. And I know a lot of people think of Rosie the Riveter, and we did put the Rosie the Riveter song on our website, a link, so you could hear it if you want. But we have to understand that rivets are for airplanes, and we're talking about people building Liberty ships. So we're really focusing a lot on Wendy the Welder and the lack of workers, because so many men had been enlisted and were serving abroad, that there was a real need to bring in women. And when you bring in women as workers, you also have to help provide childcare and care for their children. And I know Kaiser Permanente is known to this day for its healthcare provisions, but it did some very innovative ideas. And one of those was the 24-hour daycare centers. To be clear, those daycare centers were at the shipyards. The Housing Authority of Portland was running daycare centers that were not 24 hours on site. And we have images talking, we have the construction books now. So to utilize workers to the fullest extent, women were hired to do whatever work they were capable of doing. During the peak of construction of Vanport, 5,023 men and women were employed on construction. To attain this peak employment, the total number hired was approximately 13,000. So that means in that 1 year of construction that 13,000 people were employed to build Vanport. And there was a relatively large turnover of workers, because remember that housing hadn't been built And Portland had extreme lack of housing. And a lot of laborers were going to the highest paid jobs that they could find. So we look here at Kaiser records, and from April 1942 to January 1944, we see the increase of women working at the three shipyards run by Kaiser. Kaiser kept impeccable records and notations of their workforce. So we started from the first woman hired on as a welder to the time in January 1944 when the workforce had swelled to having 31,500 women workers. So 35% of the workforce in the Kaiser shipyards was women at that point. And women, you see that we have a picture of a Wendy the welder, basically. That's a welding hat she's wearing. We see women working here. And you see there's a group of people leaving the shipyards, and it's a mixed group of people. And we have more images of women welding. And I wanted to also include some examples of childcare because it was very critical that the children had somewhere to go. In Manly Mabin's book, it talks extensively about how in the daycare centers, there was very few African Americans. We know at Vanport that there was 6,000 residents who were identified as Black, and that at the daycare centers on site that there was only 3 African American children, and that the Blessed St. Martin, which had been started by Dr. Unthank, who was the second doctor of African American in the city of Portland, he worked very hard to create a space that felt safe for the Black community. So we have to understand that even though all these amenities were there, that they didn't necessarily serve all people. And here is a layout of a school. This is a typical elementary school. So it comes with recreational area, classrooms. We've got libraries. They talk about how the police officers that served in Vanport would return your late library books for you. So as they did their foot patrol, they were really doing an early version of community policing. And the schools at Vanport only went up to 8th grade. They had an agreement with the Portland public school system to allow children to go to local area high schools via public transportation. Here is the marker that I showed you before that's come a long way. It's been through graphic design. It doesn't look like a plain, simple marker anymore. And we are not referring to the flood as the Vanport flood. I know historically a lot of people have called it the flood of the Vanport flood, but it's actually the flood of 1948. And a lot of that has to do with how extensive this flooding was and the impact. So we've been speaking to Indigenous peoples about their experience and the impacts of this flood on the whole river system of the Columbia River. So it's over. The flood was used as a way to dam the river and control the river, and it had huge impacts on the environment and on Indigenous peoples who lost their way of life because of this. Vanport also had a mass migration of Indigenous peoples who were trained and then brought off the reservations because of the desperate need for workers. And so there's a lot of interlaying narratives that we're working really hard to express and portray, but leave the markers trying to have as much of it be focused on the primary resources, the images that we can find that can show what happened with the devastation of the flood. And anyone who knows that I did my work a lot on Giles Lake housing will see that that has permeated a little corner of this marker because Giles Lake was the only significantly sized project that allowed African Americans. The other one would have been Fairview Homes out in Fairview, Oregon. So since there was already 5,000 African Americans living at Giles Lake, that's where the trailers were put. And there's a picture here of the trailer. So basically FEMA surplus trailers were brought into Giles Lake, and that's where a majority of the African American community that chose to stay in Portland after this devastating flood was located too, because there wasn't enough housing still. We still had a housing shortage. This is the backside of the marker. Originally, we we've had many ideas for the backside of this first marker that's coming out, and the blank slate did not appeal to me. So this is images from headline newspapers across the United States and Canada, just so that the next generation can see, you know, this is a city that got destroyed and 18,700 people became homeless because of this flood. We show a few more pictures. So what happens is, it was the Army Corps of Engineers was watching for bubbling on the dikes and levees. The residents were told that, remember, dikes are safe at present. We know they're not really dikes, but that's another story there. If you will be warned if necessary, you have time to leave, do not get excited. And they had air raid warning systems, and they'd had practice evacuations. And sometimes I see pictures that are stated to be pictures that of, you know, evacuation from the flood, and they're actually evacuation drills, just like we do fire drills and hurricane drills and different things across this country. They had drills for evacuation. So the water started coming in, and people had about 20 minutes to leave, and then it filled the sloughs first, and then it broke through Denver Avenue, and it slowly broke through 33rd and Martin Luther King, which was Union Avenue at the time. So we actually had 4 breaks, and the houses floated down through those breaks. I really am grateful that Doug Magadan shared this color image. Doug was the collections manager at Architectural Heritage Center for many years. He happens to also be friends with Norm Golston. What you learn is people who collect historic pictures are all friends with each other. Another gentleman, Tom Robinson, has also been very helpful with sharing pictures with us, as well as the City Archives, Brian Johnson and Mary Hansen. Even though they were completely closed to the public, I was able to ask them to give us TIFF images and images based on the records that were publicly available at the archives at the city. If you didn't know, the City Archives is actually right on the PSU campus. So here's a more detailed picture of that flood and the impacts. That Columbia River Treaty was actually a treaty between Canada and the United States. So constantly, for political reasons, that flood was used to change the ecosystem. And one thing I really wanted to focus on was that this was not a community of helpless people. This is a community of helping hands. This is a community of power and strength, a community that pulled together and helped each other out. And a community that faced tragedy and tried to change. And we have a number of people that rose up and have done amazing things with their lives that came out of this community. And by marking that location, we want to honor those elders, and we want them to be able to find that history and to be able to share that history. One thing I know is that when a flood like this happens, you lose your albums, you lose your pictures, you lose everything. They barely got out of there. 18,700 people barely got out of there. And we also want to honor the 12 people that lost their lives there. And a part of that is helping them have memories, pictures, sharing those images, because when you left, they didn't have those memories. And sometimes we're able to find people who had maybe moved out of Vanport before the flood, and their pictures are saved. So getting those records and getting them shareable and getting them accessible to people wherever they are is really important. And we are talking about the color line, talking about redlining. The redlining map that's shown here in the upper right corner. This happened in 1937 when the federal government wanted to make sure that we didn't have another Great Depression, that housing could be protected. And those redlined areas were not actually drawn around African American areas, but when the African Americans got displaced out of Vanport, there was only one area that really accepted them, and that was Lower Bina. And we now have this great website called Mapping Inequity, and you can go in and you can see the enumerator reports, and you can find out the information on every area and how they came up with this color coding. And I wanted to just touch on the Vanport College just because I'm speaking to this group. So, it was great. I'm looking at what the first classes were offered, where these, same kind of mapping it's not the orange color code that I showed you earlier, but it's showing me which buildings after World War II got converted to be part of the original Vanport Extension Center College. And, you have the summer session in 1946 that had, 13 classes and 8 disciplines and 24 instructors. And then by 1951, there's 68 faculty members teaching 316 classes, and it's grown to 43 subjects and 29 majors. And you look at how to apply for admission, how to get there, how you can get your housing. It was a great reuse of the land because you have people moving out and you have people left behind. The people being left behind at Vanport were typically people of color and single mothers. A woman was still not able to sign a lease, and sometimes a man comes back from the war broken and the family falls apart. And so in many of those cases, the women got left behind. At the same time, the jobs were being given to the veterans, and the women and people of color were losing their jobs. So not only is there discrimination in the housing market against certain groups, there's also discrimination in the job market. And just a picture, I know Maryhelen asked me to put in this picture of the Vanport College sign post-flood, and I had a picture from Norman Golston's collection of the Vanport Extension Center with flood damage. And I know we all know Portland State University campus and Lincoln Hall, which had been a high school building that had been converted, just like Shattuck Hall is an elementary school building that had been converted. I often forget that there is actually a home in between where Oregon Shipyard was converted. And so here's an article in the Oregonian showing kind of a home in between the homes, just like more in the St. John's area. And I know we want to do Q&A, and I know we're all kind of on a lunch break, so we can stop screen sharing because I miss seeing all your faces. And I talk really fast, and I apologize in advance for that.
I also want to add a couple things. None of this would have happened without Tanya's expertise and connections. I have just, I call it herded cats, found people that are very interested in the project and lent us information through interviews, for contacts, sharing pictures, sharing images. And that's why this project has been successful. It's a wide group of people, from the Home Builders Association to artists to people that would normally not all be in the same room at the same time, but Vanport has struck an interest to them. And one of the difficult things that we've had is being able to do all the things that we envision should be done. And when we talk about the Vanport College and had this conversation, excited that building on 4th and whatever is called the Vanport building, and there'll be some permanent artwork installed there. Ed Washington has been a great spokesperson for Vanport history, and he's been connected to Portland State for a very long time, and to the region, and shared his memories. And those are the kinds of people that have made this project be so successful to date. So I in my list of what I call organized chaos is a item to put a sign at the Vanport College, work with all of you, with the university, etc. But I'm a volunteer director. Tanya gets paid probably 10% of what she should get paid to do the work that she's done. And so the money has gone into the project, into the signs, and we identified that first sign that you saw with the graphics, and then the backside will be news headlines. That sign will be put out with, and I don't know if you're familiar with PIR, but there's a pathway that goes from the MAX station up, and there's big giant white gears on posts, and the PIR people call them the lollipops. Well, it's a wide spot in the walking space, and there's also a parking pull-off. So we decided to put our first sign there because, one, it was in the urban renewal area, that the urban growth boundary that Prosper deals with, and they would fund projects there. And because it would attract, it might, I don't know how many people will stop, I guess we'll see, but over 300 in a normal year, I don't know what normal will be beyond this, but in a normal year, 300,000 people attend events at PIR. And the estimate from the Parks Bureau is that over 2/3 of them ride public transportation or park at Metro. So they would be walking by there. So the propensity for exposure is great in that spot. And as Tanya said, much of the site is not available because of the current use of the golf course and racing events. But this where we've chosen to put the signs are in areas that someone attending an event, like Tanya's alluded to, if somebody gets bored with watching the car races, they can walk around and see this sign or walk to see that sign. And that was our hope, is because previously the bus tour was the only time anybody got to see anything, quote unquote, behind the fences. Park Bureau has also agreed to, on days that it's manageable for the PIR staff, to get behind those fences. So in the case of down the road, tour operator and beautiful connection here, Tanya also owns Slab Town Tours. So they could do a Vanport tour once a quarter. If a group of you wanted to go there, right now we could arrange that, but in the future it'll be PIR staff, and they'll find someone to take you on the tour, and it'll probably be Tanya. But those opportunities have happened because of this project. So I'll be quiet right here because I want Tanya to be able to be available to answer questions that you might have. But I really appreciate your attendance at the meeting to listen to this. And if you want more information, Tanya put the website in the chat room, and there's a wealth of information there to learn more. Because obviously you can't put too much on a sign because nobody's going to stand there and read it for a half hour. So that's why we chose that. And the 2 prototypes that'll follow will be put up near the theater site. And those, like she said, are in the form of design with Ramsey Signs, who the other part of that, me wanting to show that sign of Vanport College falling in the water, we believe that Ramsey Signs made that because they have records of making signs at Vanport. They just don't know which ones they made at this point. So
I would like to say that my dad was a horseman, spent a lot of time at Portland Meadows, and during the flood, his friend took him up and took pictures of the flooded area, which I will try and scan and send to the website. But I grew up listening to stories of the waters rising around the barns and getting the horses out of the barns. And it just gives me chills, and I am ever so grateful for this lovely presentation and a pathway to more information. Thank you, Tanya and Maryhelen. A lot of people, I remember, I'm sure people remember the flood. I'm not the oldest one here, but anyway, thank you.
I actually have a question about the veterans and the VA benefits. Do you have any kind of a handle on how the veteran benefits interacted with the Vanport College?
So I know that some of the housing was actually moved to Salem from Giles Lake and Vanport to create veterans villages at different colleges. You know, so I know that, and I know my dad tells me he went to UC Davis, and the housing that he lived in when he went there had been Defense era war housing. So I understood, because I talked to my grandfather, that that was one of the benefits of coming back from serving in World War II, was to have your college tuition paid for. And the fact that there was an area in Vanport set aside for veterans, you know, and that it was furnished housing. I think that's fascinating. And I see that we have, you know, some more things coming in the chat, but those are critical. And I know they've changed over time, so that people who serve in Desert Fox get different benefits in Desert Storm. So this hasn't been consistent for people that I've talked to who've served in our armed forces. And I'm happy to get more the exact numbers for you, but I don't have them on my fingertips in my head. But it was a huge benefit that I wish we honored more. And I know when I taught at PSU, you know, that was something very important. I think some of this distance learning has really helped for people who have injuries or things that make it harder for them to get to the classroom, to increase access. And I think that's something we need to focus on more, because if we don't look at that history, we forget it.
So I'm pretty sure that the quote married student housing at University of Oregon came from Vanport, out in a bare field. And I'm quite sure that that came from Vanport, that housing. So Dawn, I'm thinking that a tour for RAPS would be a great program sometime. I'd love to go on it.
As would I.
And I'm sorry that Bill Lemon wasn't here today, since he attended Vanport.
Well, we can arrange a tour, but I would suggest, and I don't know if you would agree, when the parks are opening for events, and so maybe later towards, I don't know when you meet, gather, whatever, but can work that out with Don or you, when the best timing would be. But I know there's a lot of hesitancy now, even, and 6 foot distancing with 15, say, people would be rather difficult. And we might have the other 2 signs up, so you would be able to see those. And
Probably sometime next year.
yeah, okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yay!
Mhm.
Does anyone else have any questions?
I
It's
have a
good to see
question.
you here, Carl.
I have a question. Last month, we heard from President Steve Percy, who was telling us about the new Vanport building, and he referenced the Vanport place marking project, but we didn't really have time to go into it. So I'm curious to know if what's happening in terms of a presence for the place marking project in the new Vanport building. Is something happening in that regard?
We've not been involved in the planning. Ed Washington and the Vanport Mosaic have talked about the permanent display. We'd certainly welcome the opportunity to be involved, but I hate to punt to Mark at this point.
Well,
but maybe Mark
to be
can-
clear, he didn't reference it by name, but he
Okay.
referenced it. And so I jumped to the conclusion that it was you folks, but perhaps it was Ed and something else that was connected with Vanport, the site connecting to Vanport, the new building.
The Vanport recognition that's going in the lobby, I don't know exactly what form it's taking. They've got a committee. Somebody other than me might know more about how that's being chosen. But I support every opportunity to remember Vanport, and Vanport Mosaic is the ones that brought the memory alive, acted their memory activism by doing oral histories, etc. And so they focus on stories and historical memories of people. We, because we're on city and park land, we're told very directly that ours could not be stories. They had to be verifiable facts. So when we said this was here and this happened, we had to be able to have reference to that. And Tanya's done a very good job of, because there's a lot of opinions of what happened there. And I can tell you a lot of anecdotal stories about people that have said things to me. And the people that know me know that I'm sort of quick to the trigger to respond. And I've had to almost make my tongue bleed to bite it sometimes.
Mhm.
And it's important that we have the historical facts, and it's important that we have the stories, because the stories are what enrich the historical fact. You know, to say a building was there, I say this all the time, to say a building was there is great, but to understand what the people did in that building is even better. And another, as I referenced my organizational chaos, Metro did and I don't know if any of you have witnesses, but audio post at the zoo. So you could go and hear a story about a panda bear or whatever, you know, we want to be able to put those audio posts. So hear a story from Don White, and Don tells her story, and you can stand there at the site and listen to it. We think that that can also work with augmented reality. And we've been so fortunate that Sarah Design's taken that project on, because an augmented reality with audio at the site is probably a $120,000 project. They're doing it all. So I think there's lots of opportunity there, and maybe that opportunity can also be connected somehow with the Vanport building in the future.
And just FYI, Portland State, the RAPS organization actually put together a really lovely framed picture with information about Vanport that was on display in Smith Center for some years. It's been taken down, but we're hopeful that it will be put back up in the new Vanport building.
Like I said earlier, the more the better. I mean, the more people can learn and see, it's benefits us all. I can't tell you how much I've learned. I mean, it's incredible.
Mark, not to put you on the spot, but do you know something about the Vanport building and the display?
No, I don't. What I can say is that President Percy has been very supportive through letters of support that have helped with some of the funding that Maryhelen's group has been able to obtain. But no, I'm sorry, I haven't been involved with that particular project. However, I am involved with another project that has potential, I think, for connecting in a positive, maybe even financial way with Maryhelen and Tanya's project, which is the new Urban Flood Safety and Water Quality District. Maryhelen, are you familiar with that?
All right. Yes, I'm on the interim board.
Oh,
and the
excellent.
U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has talked about flood height poles markers, as well as more extensive archaeological work. But hopefully nobody's a U.S. Army Corps of Engineer person. They're slower than a donkey. I mean, this project, the Urban Flood Safety Water Quality District, which I'm advocating for a new name and call it just the Urban District or Urban Water District, is going to offer all kinds of opportunities. And one of them that they're interested in, because of the government tie-in, is back to the question that Don had, the veterans and what happened to them and how they were treated at the site. Because there's some controversy over how they were moved around, treated, etc. And so, yes, I think, and in the talks, we've talked about Vanport College because it's a Portland institution that started there and moved, to its current location. And there is somebody from Portland State on the board. I don't recall her name. There's like 15 people on the initial board, and it's it's one of those things that in my lifetime I hope I get to see the final product, but they're anticipating 2025 for it to be up and operating and have general bonds and all that. So. But we should talk more, I think, about if a connection to your website, your Facebook page, something on your page, because I think the Vanport College is a major part of Vanport and needs to be recognized on site. So moving forward, we might be able to work something along that lines.
Good. Don, anything else?
Nothing about this. I do have an announcement before we close, but it's not related to this.
Any other questions for Maryhelen or Tanya or anyone else?
Well, thank
That
you
was so interesting. I can't wait to go on a tour.
Oh, and thank you very much for having us. And like I said, stay in touch. And if you have questions that come up, like I do somebody's got there, at 2 a.m. in the morning, write them down and let us know. Like I do at 2 a.m. morning, write them down.
Thank you.
Dawn?
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Maryhelen and Tanya. That was so wonderful and informative. I'm going to look at the recording so I can watch it.
Okay, thank you. Bye. Have a good afternoon.
Before you leave, though, before you leave, members, stay around for just a brief announcement. Samantha, can you everybody but me? I'm still getting feedback. Are we good? Okay, thank you. Pat mentioned that our next event is going to be the picnic in August on the 19th, but there's actually a special event coming up in July that has been added to our program that I want to tell you about. I want you to reserve Thursday, July 15th, because we are invited to Nancy Land. Nancy Land is the garden of Nancy Goldman, who worked at Portland State for 30 years. And in the 20-some years since she's retired, she's been a very familiar face around campus, working in various short-term administrative capacities. Nancy is very well known as a gardener. She's a former president of the Hardy Plant Society. She's led garden tours to European countries, and she has an amazing garden in her backyard on Northeast Skidmore, full of plants and flowers and interesting art made out of found objects. And she has invited us to an open garden at her home on that Thursday, July 15th, from 10 to 12 noon. She suggested morning in case it's a hot day, but this event is going to happen rain or shine. So you're welcome to come anytime between 10 and 12, stop by, look at Nancy's garden, chat with her, and chat with your other RAPS colleagues. We'll be sending information out about this via our email contacts. Her address is 4527 Northeast Skidmore. You don't necessarily need to write that down now, but put that on your calendar. It really will be the first time that we'll be able to see each other in person. So come one and come all. Thank you.
And we need to get Nancy to be a member.
Yes.
Yeah, we can all persuade her. Thank you, everyone. It's so good to see everybody. And thanks again to our wonderful Samantha. Steve and Samantha and I interviewed our first candidate to try to fill Samantha's shoes today. And we have several other interviews coming up. Doug, we do have one more newsletter. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. We have a newsletter coming out. I haven't quite figured out what the deadline will be, but probably July 20th or so. And we'll try and get it out, August 1st into people's inboxes.
Great. All right. Anybody else have anything for the good of the order? Steve?
Yeah, the survey that Samantha put together is out and being filled out. I filled mine out. I was the 22nd person to do the survey, and the feedback is pretty interesting. So if you have any inclination at all to have your views known, please fill out the survey.
Samantha sent it out, I think 2 days ago, or maybe just yesterday. I filled mine out right away too. So please do, it's easy to fill out and send it back. Anything else, Steve, Dawn? All right. Thanks, everyone. We will hopefully